Wow, you really went all out with the sources for this deep dive on the civil rights movement. Amazing. We've got historical overviews, legal deep dives, even personal stories from those who lived through it all. I can tell you're not just interested in the big events, but in really understanding how all the pieces of the puzzle fit together.
It's fascinating to see how much you've focused on those different forces at work.
Hmm?
The legal battles, the grassroots organizing, the shifts in strategy over time. It really shows a desire to grasp the complexity of how social change actually happens.
Absolutely. And there's no better place to start than with Reconstruction, that period after the Civil War when the nation was trying to reconstruct itself. We've got these incredible amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th,
Yeah.
that felt like such a huge step forward.
Well,
And slavery is abolished, equal protection under the law, the right to vote regardless of race. It seemed like America was finally living up to its ideals.
on paper, it certainly looked promising. But as we see from your sources, the reality on the ground quickly turned into something far more challenging. What emerges is the rise of Jim Crow laws, a system designed to systematically strip away those newly won rights and maintain white supremacy.
Hold on, disenfranchise them.
Yeah.
That's like taking away someone's right to vote right. And that's exactly what these Jim Crow laws were doing, using tactics like poll taxes and literacy tests that were specifically designed to keep Black Americans from voting.
Exactly. These weren't just abstract legal maneuvers. They had a direct impact on people's daily lives, creating a system of segregation and inequality that permeated every aspect of society.
And then, of course, we have Plessy v. Ferguson, that infamous Supreme Court ruling in 1896. Separate but equal. I mean, how can separate ever be equal?
Precisely. And what's crucial for you to understand is that Plessy cast a long shadow over everything that followed. Legal challenges, while essential, take time to wind their way through the courts. Meanwhile, Black Americans were facing the brutal realities of segregation every single day.
So it's this constant two-pronged fight, right? Battling for legal change while simultaneously trying to navigate and resist the immediate injustices of the system. This early period really sets the stage for the long game of the movement. The understanding that this wouldn't be a quick or easy victory.
Absolutely. And even in these early years, you see Black Americans actively organizing, resisting, and laying the groundwork for the larger movement to come. They understood that this fight would require sustained effort, strategic thinking, and an unwavering commitment to justice.
Okay, so we've got this bleak picture of the post-Reconstruction South. But then World War II happens and things start to shift, don't they?
Hmm.
Black Americans are fighting for democracy overseas while still being denied basic freedoms at home. It's this glaring hypocrisy that becomes harder and harder to ignore.
It's a truly pivotal moment. The war created this incredible tension. You have Black soldiers risking their lives for a country that doesn't afford them full citizenship. It highlighted the contradictions at the heart of American democracy, and it fueled a renewed push for civil rights back home.
Talk about a double victory. Defeating fascism abroad and then coming home ready to tackle racism head on. It wasn't just the moral argument either, right? With the Cold War heating up, the U.S. suddenly had to worry about how it looked on the world stage. Segregation was becoming a major PR problem.
Exactly. Having this stark system of racial inequality wasn't exactly helping the U.S. make its case for democracy and freedom. So you start to see some concrete actions taken during this period, even if they seem small in retrospect.
Okay, give me some examples. What kind of actions are we talking about?
Well, in 1941, President Roosevelt issues Executive Order 8802 prohibiting discrimination in defense industries. This was a direct response to the planned March on Washington, organized by A. Philip Randolph, who threatened to bring thousands of Black protesters to the nation's capital. It shows the power of collective action, how putting pressure on the government could actually force change.
And then a few years later, 1948, President Truman desegregates the armed forces with Executive Order 9981. Again, you see this interplay of factors, the moral argument against segregation, combined with the Cold War pressure to present a united front against communism. Things are moving, but it feels like it's happening in slow motion. Then we get to a story that everyone knows, Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott. It's such an iconic moment, but your sources point out there's a lot more to it than the simple narrative we usually hear.
Absolutely. The popular story often focuses solely on Rosa Parks, but it's important to acknowledge that her act of defiance was part of a larger pattern of resistance. Months earlier, a young woman named Claudette Colvin had done the same thing, refusing to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus. Her story highlights that this wasn't simply a spontaneous act, but a growing wave of defiance against the indignities of segregation.
That's so important. It makes it even more powerful knowing that Rosa Parks was building on a foundation that others had already laid. And then the boycott itself. That wasn't just about one person. It was a masterclass in grassroots organizing. Over a year, the black community in Montgomery refused to ride the buses, demonstrating their economic and social power in a way that couldn't be ignored.
The boycott was meticulously organized, and it's important to remember the key roles played by women like Joanne Robinson, who really spearheaded the effort. It wasn't just about famous figures, it was about everyday people coming together to demand change.
I love that the sources highlighted Joanne Robinson's contributions. It shows how essential those behind-the-scenes organizers are to any successful movement. And this wasn't just some feel-good story. The Montgomery bus boycott had a real impact on the legal landscape.
You're right. The Supreme Court case, Browder v. Gale, building on the momentum of the boycott, ultimately ruled that segregation on Montgomery buses was unconstitutional. And it's important to understand why this ruling was so significant. It directly used the boycott success to demonstrate that segregated buses violated the Constitution. This wasn't just a moral victory, it had real legal teeth.
So once again, we see that powerful combination of grassroots action and legal strategy working hand in hand. And of course, this victory in Montgomery, along with the rise in prominence of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the formation of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, really solidified nonviolent protest as a core strategy of the movement.
Which I think leads us into what many consider the classic civil rights movement period, where education becomes a major battleground.
That's exactly where we're headed. And it all starts with a landmark Supreme Court case that many thought would be the final blow to segregation. Brown v. Board of Education.
This one felt like a knockout punch, right? In 1954, the Supreme Court declares school segregation unconstitutional. It seemed like separate but equal was finally dead. It was a monumental victory, no doubt. But as we see time and time again, legal victories don't always translate to immediate social change. The devil, as they say, was in the details. The court's ruling called for desegregation to proceed with all deliberate speed.
Wait, all deliberate speed. Sounds awfully vague.
It does, doesn't it? And unfortunately,
I don't-
those three words created a loophole that many southern states exploited, delaying integration for years. They essentially used it as an excuse to drag their feet and resist the ruling.
So it's like winning the battle, but not the war. It must have been so frustrating for those who thought Brown v. Board would finally mean equal access to education.
Absolutely. And what followed was a stark contrast in responses. You had places like Greensboro, North Carolina, moving relatively peacefully towards integration. But then you had states like Virginia engaging in massive resistance, some counties even going so far as to close their public schools entirely rather than integrate.
While closing schools altogether. That shows just how far some were willing to go to defy the Supreme Court and maintain segregation.
It really does. And that's where the story of the Little Rock Nine becomes so essential. It vividly captures the intensity of the resistance to integration and the high stakes involved. In 1957, you have 9 courageous black students trying to attend Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, met with vicious mobs and outright defiance from the state's governor, Orville Fagus. It was a powder keg, and it forced the federal government to take a stand.
This is where it gets really intense, right? President Eisenhower ends up sending in the army to escort these kids to school. It's this dramatic illustration of the clash between state and federal power and the lengths to which the government had to go to enforce the Supreme Court's ruling.
It's a powerful moment for you to consider. The sheer bravery of those 9 students facing down such hostility and hatred, and the recognition by the federal government that integration wouldn't happen without their intervention.
It's also a stark reminder that even with landmark legal victories like Brown v. Board, actual change on the ground could be incredibly slow, dangerous, and hard-fought.
Indeed. And as we move further into the civil rights movement, we'll see this pattern repeated. Legal progress followed by fierce resistance, requiring even bolder strategies and actions to overcome.
So we've seen how legal battles were crucial, but what about the people on the ground? This is where the Montgomery bus boycott really shows the power of grassroots organizing. But the movement didn't stop there. It's
Yeah.
like the momentum from those early victories fueled a desire to challenge segregation everywhere, not just in schools or on buses.
That's a great observation. The movement starts to expand its focus, targeting all areas of public life. We see the rise of direct action tactics, civil disobedience, really forcing the issue of desegregation in a way that couldn't be ignored.
Yeah, things start to heat up. We're talking sit-ins, freedom rides, actions that put activists directly in the line of fire, often facing shocking violence.
Exactly. The sit-ins, starting in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1960, were a brilliant example of nonviolent protest. Black students would simply sit at segregated lunch counters, refusing to leave until they were served. It was peaceful, dignified, but also incredibly disruptive to the status quo, and it spread like wildfire across the South.
This tactic was genius because it exposed the absurdity of segregation in a way everyone could understand. You can't argue with someone peacefully demanding service. It forces a confrontation with the inherent injustice of the system.
Yeah.
And then the freedom rides.
Mhm.
Wow, the sources you provided really brought home the danger those activists faced. A bus firebombed in Anniston, Alabama, Bull Connor unleashing dogs and fire hoses on peaceful protesters in Birmingham. It's hard to imagine facing that kind of hatred.
These images, broadcast on national television, were seared into the public consciousness. They revealed the brutal reality of segregation and sparked outrage across the country. It's a turning point in terms of public opinion, making it impossible for people to ignore what was happening in the South.
It seems like the movement was strategically using these moments of shocking violence to sway public opinion, to make it impossible for people to look away.
Precisely. And it worked. The moral weight of these events, the sheer courage of the activists facing down such hatred, forced the Kennedy administration to take a more active role in pushing for desegregation.
So we've got desegregation happening in schools, on buses, and restaurants.
Yeah.
But what about the right to vote? It seems like that remained a huge obstacle, especially in the South.
Absolutely. The fight for voting rights was absolutely central to the movement. And it was in Mississippi, the state with the most deeply entrenched system of disenfranchisement, where this struggle reached its peak.
Mississippi was notorious for its voter suppression tactics. The sources detailed some truly insidious stuff. Literacy tests designed to be impossible to pass, economic reprisals against those who dared to register, and of course, outright violence.
And you can trace those tactics directly back to those early Jim Crow laws we talked about. Poll taxes, literacy tests. They were all deliberately crafted to exclude Black voters, and even decades later, that legacy continued. It's a stark reminder of how deeply rooted these systems of oppression were.
The sources specifically mentioned the voter registration drives in Mississippi. The incredible courage of those activists who risked their lives to register voters. It's heartbreaking to read about the murders of civil rights workers like Herbert Lee and the disappearance of James Chaney Good, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner during Freedom Summer in 1964. It's hard to fathom that level of sacrifice.
Those stories are incredibly powerful, and they speak to the unwavering determination of the movement. Despite the risks, Black voter registration surged during this period, and it had a real impact on elections, shifting the political landscape in the South in a way that couldn't be reversed.
It's like the movement is saying, we're not just asking for rights, we're demanding them, and we're willing to put our lives on the line to make it happen.
Exactly. And this fight for voting rights, culminating in the Selma to Montgomery marches in 1965, would ultimately lead to the passage of the Voting Rights Act, one of the most significant legislative achievements of the movement.
So by this point, we've seen how nonviolence has been this central, powerful strategy of the movement. But then we get to Malcolm X, a figure who offers a very different perspective.
Yes, the introduction of Malcolm X into the narrative provides a crucial counterpoint. And it's important to avoid those simplistic portrayals of him. While he initially advocated for Black separatism as a member of the Nation of Islam, his views evolved after he left the organization.
Right. The sources focused on his later years, his willingness to work with other civil rights groups, but with a more militant stance, advocating self-defense and a more confrontational approach.
His presence challenged Dr. King and the nonviolent wing of the movement, but it also had this unintended effect of putting pressure on the government to act faster on civil rights. There was the sense that if the government didn't address these issues, more radical voices might gain traction.
It's fascinating because it wasn't that Malcolm X was advocating violence at that point, but his very presence created this urgency. The sources even mentioned that SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, invited Malcolm X to speak in Selma during the voting rights campaign. And shortly after that, President Johnson publicly supported the campaign.
It's a really complex dynamic. You have these different voices and strategies within the movement, pushing and pulling, challenging each other, but ultimately contributing to the larger goal of equality.
Okay, so all this activism, all this struggle is ultimately leading to some major legislative landmarks, right? The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. These seem like huge victories.
They absolutely were. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. It desegregated public accommodations and gave the federal government more power to enforce these provisions. It's hard to overstate how transformative this was.
And the Voting Rights Act of 1965, as we discussed, finally removed those barriers to voting that had been in place for so long.
These were monumental achievements directly tied to the campaigns and sacrifices of so many activists. It's crucial for you to understand that these laws didn't just magically appear. They were hard-won, the result of years of struggle and pressure from the civil rights movement.
But the sources also suggest that even with these landmark legal victories, the fight was far from over. It's like cracking open the door to equality, but then realizing there's still so many barriers to break down.
Unfortunately, yes. The movement exposed how deeply embedded racism was in America, and simply passing laws wasn't enough to dismantle it. There were still so many areas where discrimination persisted, particularly when it came to things like housing and economic opportunity.
The sources highlighted the ongoing struggles for fair housing as a prime example of this. Even with the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act in place, discrimination in housing continued. It's crazy how that fight is still going on today. We're still seeing cases of housing inequality and segregation, a direct legacy of those practices that were allowed to continue for so long.
The Fair Housing Act, aimed at addressing this issue, faced a long and difficult fight. It wasn't until after the assassination of Dr. King in 1968 and the wave of riots that followed that it finally passed. It's a tragic irony that it took the death of one of the movement's most prominent leaders to finally push this legislation through.
Wow, that's heavy. It feels like we're seeing this pattern over and over again. Progress followed by backlash, victory followed by tragedy.
It underscores the complexity and enduring challenges of achieving racial equality in America, and it's a crucial point for you to grapple with as we move towards concluding this deep dive.
It makes you really think about the long arc of history, how much was accomplished, but also how much work remains to be done. It's inspiring to see how those who came before us fought for change, but it also reminds us that the fight for equality is an ongoing process.
What's fascinating here is that your sources don't shy away from that complexity.
Yeah.
They highlight the movement's lasting legacy. Things like affirmative action, which came about as a direct result of these struggles. But they also acknowledge that the fight for equality continues. We're still grappling with issues like economic disparity and systemic racism, showing just how deep-rooted these problems are.
Yeah, it's not enough to just celebrate the victories of the past. We have to understand how those victories connect to the challenges we face today. It makes you appreciate the ongoing efforts of those who are carrying the torch, fighting for social justice right now. They're building on the foundation laid by the civil rights movement, but also confronting new obstacles and adapting to a changing world.
It's crucial for you to connect this history to the present, to see how those seeds planted during the civil rights movement continue to bear fruit, but also require constant nurturing and vigilance. It's an ongoing process, and it's important to understand our role in that process.
Honestly, I'm blown away by how much we've covered. It's a testament to how much you packed into these sources,
Yeah.
but it also feels like we've just scratched the surface. There's so much more to explore, so many stories and perspectives that make up this rich tapestry of history.
You're absolutely right. We've journeyed through some of the most pivotal moments and figures of the civil rights movement, but it's really just a starting point. There are countless individuals who contributed to this struggle, whose names we may never know, but whose legacies continue to shape our world. Their stories are just as important, just as powerful.
And that's what makes it so compelling, right? It's not just about dates and names. It's about the human stories, the courage, the resilience, the unwavering belief in a better future. And here's where I think it gets really interesting for you. The sources we've looked at have focused on the U.S., but this movement's impact went far beyond its borders. It made me wonder, how did the civil rights movement influence movements for equality worldwide? What lessons did activists in other countries learn from the struggles of Black Americans?
That's such an important question. The civil rights movement, with its emphasis on nonviolence, its strategic use of media, and its unwavering commitment to justice, became a model for activists all over the globe. From the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa to the fight for human rights in Latin America, you can see echoes of this movement in countless corners of the world. It's inspiring to see how those fighting for freedom in different contexts found inspiration and guidance in the strategies and principles of the civil rights movement.
It's incredible to think about the ripple effect, how the fight for equality in one country could inspire and empower people around the world to stand up for their own rights. And it leaves us with a sense of both the monumental achievements of the past and the ongoing work that remains to be done. It's a reminder that the pursuit of justice is a global endeavor, and that each of us has a role to play in creating a more equitable and just world.
Beautifully said. This deep dive has not only illuminated a crucial chapter in history, but also, I hope, ignited a passion in you to continue exploring these issues, to connect the past to the present, and to find your own ways to contribute to the ongoing fight for equality and justice.
Tell us what you think about this episode. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.